All right, in this video, we're gonna briefly talk about file structure best practices and how to basically create our project and structure out the files within our folder. So let's skip to that section here. So in the previous video, we talked about different development tools such as IDEs versus text editors, and then we also talked a little about local development and cloud development. Right? At this point, you should already have the text editor installed on your machine, and that's Visual Studio Code. So make sure you have the text editor before proceeding with this video. And another thing that I had you guys download and install was the Open in Browser extension. So make sure you have those two things installed, the editor as well as this Open in Browser extension. All right, so let's dig into file structure here. So when you're building a website, essentially a website is nothing but a bunch of files within a folder, right? For instance, if I were to go to a site, let's go to, let's say there's an ice cream shop in St. Paul. I have it pulled up already. Let's Google it. It's called Two Scoops Ice Cream Eatery. This website that you see here is essentially just a site that's hosted on a server somewhere in the world. But essentially when you boil it down, it's nothing but a folder. So if I were to right click and hit inspect, and I'm going to go over to sources, and you'll see with sources here, this is the root, and we'll talk more about this root directory. But in this folder here, we have this WP content folder, we have this W includes folder, and it has some additional content within those folders, some other folders and other files. So here's your CSS files, here's your JavaScript files. Like I said, this may not make a lot of sense right now, but the point I want to drive home here is that the site itself is essentially a folder that's hosted on a server, and it has a particular structure. So let's talk about how to create that structure here. So when you're developing your website, you can develop your site within a text editor or a cloud-based editor, and it's going to have a particular folder structure. So here's an example of a single folder structure where you have your root folder or your application folder, and you have an index.html page, a page1.html. Essentially all your files are going to go into a folder. There's no particular hierarchical structure. It's just that all the files exist within a folder. Now this is pretty easy to do. It's because when you want to basically reference different resources or different files, all you have to do is just give it the name. Then there's what we call a hierarchical folder structure, where you have your application folder, you have your index file, your different HTML files, and then the idea here is that you want to basically group your files according to their kind. So for instance, if you have CSS files, you want to put them into a CSS folder. If you have image files, you want to put them into an image folder. We kind of naturally do this already, where for instance, you may have already done this for this school year. For my class, you're going to put all of your notes, all of your information about, if you have like a Word document that you're taking notes on, you're going to put it into a folder called CWeb 1010. If you're taking another instructor's class, you're going to basically put all your notes into another folder for that instructor, right? Kind of the same thing for a website. There's different types of files. There's image files, there's JavaScript files, there's CSS files. And what you're trying to do is basically kind of trying to group those files. All right. So let's actually do an example of this here. So go ahead and pull up the editor. And let me just stress this point here. The first thing you want to do whenever you create a web project is to create a folder. The first thing you want to do when you create a web project is to create a folder. The first thing you want to do when you want to create a web project is to create a folder. The first thing you want to do when you create a web project is you want to create a folder. Now, this video is not broken. I'm stressing that point because that is the very first step when you want to create a web project. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a folder on my desktop, and I'm just going to right click, and that's going to say new folder. I'm just going to call this, let's just call this example _1. Right, and you can save this folder anywhere you want on your machine. In this case, I'm saving it to my desktop. Right, so that's my folder, and that folder is created. It's on my desktop. What I'm going to do is now open that folder within my editor. So there's a couple different ways I can do that. I can click on this red button here that says open folder, or I can go file, open folder, and what I'm going to do is to search for that particular folder of wherever I saved it at. In this case here, it's saved on my desktop, and so I'm going to click on example 1, select folder, and what I'm going to do here, that folder is now open within my editor. In the last video, we talked about these icons. I'm going to say a lot more about these icons as the class go on, but this here is what we call our explore icon. And within the explore icon, we have 3 different tabs. We have an open edit, the files that are open within the editor, and then you'll see that here we have this is going to be the tab here that shows us our file structure, and then there's 2 other tabs that we're not going to necessarily give a lot of attention to right now, which is the outline and the timeline. The 2 that we're concerned about is the file structure here, which we're going to create in just a second, and the files that are open within our editor. Currently, the welcome screen is open within our editor. So if we were to click off or close the welcome screen, you'll see that now there's no files within our open within our editor. So there's a couple different ways we can actually create files to create this folder structure. So let's go ahead and do that now. Is create this file structure. You'll see that there's 2 icons here, right? One says new file and one says new folder. I'm going to use the functionality or these icons to create the folder structure and also create files within my folder structure here. So if I want to create an HTML file, I want to click on that icon and say index. I'm going to name it index.html. Right? And the extension is extremely important that you name it HTML. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and we're going to get into that next week and when we open up a new lecture slide. But the extension is extremely important because that's going to indicate that this is an HTML file. It's just like if you were saving a Word document, right? You would save it .doc, and that would indicate that it's a Word document. So here's our index.html file, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a hierarchical folder structure. We're going to create a folder here. Remember, don't create this here, right? Click on this icon to create a folder. Now, the tricky thing about Visual Studio Code is that you want to make sure that you're in the root folder. So I like to just click on this open area, and you'll see this blue highlighted area. That lets me know that I'm creating a file within this area and not necessarily within another file. So here, I'll go ahead and click on that again. And what I'm going to do is create a CSS folder. And I'm going to create an IMG folder. And here I can go and search and add some more images, or I can add some CSS files. But in this case here, I'm going to click on the CSS folder and highlight it. And I'll click on new file, and I'll say style.css. And we're going to talk about what a CSS file stands for, cascading style sheet. But nonetheless, I have a file that's going to be nested within the CSS folder. Like I said, don't get confused by this. This here is just a file. Here's where I create the new folder, right? I can also right click and achieve the same objective. All right, so if we were to look back at our folder now, right? And like I said, don't get confused. All we're doing here is just creating files within a folder. You've been doing this all along, right? So if we look at our folder here, right, we have a CSS folder, an IMG folder, an INDX folder file. And then within our CSS folder, we have a style sheet. And somebody always asks the question, could I just create the files within the folder? Yeah, you could have done that, right? That would suffice. right? So here I can go and say write, and I can say new file, right? And I can give this a name. The tricky thing is that you want to make sure that you give it the correct extension, right? So that's why it's sometimes best to create that file within the editor. So I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to pause this video. And like I said, we'll review this again, but nonetheless, what I've done here is I created a hierarchical folder structure where all my CSS files are grouped together within the CSS folder. And I don't have any images yet, but I will put all of my images within the image folder. And then I have an index within the root folder of my example 1_1 web project. So let's jump back to our slides here. So here we create a hierarchical folder structure. Let me jump to the next slide here, right? And this is kind of what you're going to do for every project in my class. You're going to create, whenever you create a web project, you're going to create a folder and begin to give it scaffold that folder structure. And so most of your applications for my class is going to look like this. You're going to have a CSS folder. You're going to have an IMG folder, a JavaScript folder. Now, do you have to name it JS, IMG? No, you don't. You can name it images. You can name it CSS 12, whatever it may be. But most people typically name it, or they abbreviate the folder names. And then here you'll see in the root, you have about, context, index. And you could, if you wanted to, you can actually group those files if you wanted. But it's just more simpler and easier is to keep those a part of your root. So that's how you would create a folder structure and essentially scaffold a website. Scaffold a website. All right, I'm going to end this video, and like I said, we'll review this again. But the next video we'll get into talking about absolute versus relative file paths.